in U.S. history! This course surveys the role of women in the historical development of the United States from contact until the Civil War, examining a range of topics like contact, colonization, institution building, and education.
And we have read about, heard about, and talked about so many women throughout this semester. Some of the modules that we discussed them in were Native American life and culture,
Colonial life,
Revolutionary America,
and women's place.
And since we learned about so many extraordinary women, we figured we would interview our favorites from each module. Let's go!
It's so nice to have you with us. Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So now you fit in the module where we discuss Native American life and culture, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Just a fantastic read. I love learning your story. Now tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my parents were Thomas and Jane Jimison. I was born in the fall of 1743, aboard a ship actually called the William and Mary. We lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and well, during the war, my parents were actually killed, and I ended up living with an Indian tribe. I told my story to a minister, James E. Sever, and he had a captivity narrative written about me and published called Narrative of the Life of Mrs. Mary Jimison. And there's also a bronze statue of me that was created in 1910, along with other things, and so that's about it.
Wow, what an extraordinary life! You have such a story. Now, speaking of your captivity narrative, could you tell me a little bit more about your time there?
I was taken captive as a teenager and lived with the Seneca Iroquois tribe. When I became of age, I married a Delaware man named Shenenji. We married by Indian customs, and I had a son with him. His name was Thomas, after my father. Shenenji later passed away, and I married a Seneca man and had 6 children with him, but I'm not going to go into that because it's a bad family history there. And as far as captivity goes, I really did develop a favorable view of my captors, unlike some people. I'm not going to name any names. Rowlandson.
Yes. She did not develop a favorable view of her captors at all, did she?
No! I mean, seriously, Rowlandson! Taking food from a child! Everyone was starving, not just you!
And didn't you actually learn the language?
I did actually, and I wanted to be able to communicate with them so that I could trade and make the best of the situation. Unlike someone.
You actually demonstrated a great deal of agency, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I most definitely took conscious actions to better the situation I was in for the lives of others, specifically my children, to give security to them.
And you stayed with the Seneca tribe, right?
Oh, yes, I love them so much, and after spending so much time with them, I just could not leave.
Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing your story with us.
Thank you for allowing me. Oh, well, what a treat to have you with us today. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. You are just one of the most interesting stories to read. Would you mind telling us a little bit about your life?
Why, of course. I was born May 8, 1753 in West Africa. I was kidnapped at the age of 8 and brought to Boston, Massachusetts on a slave ship. And when I arrived in Boston, a man by the name of John Wheatley purchased me for his wife Susanna and their 2 children. I actually began going by Wheatley and immediately fell under Susanna's wing. Susanna happened to be very intelligent herself and taught me to read and encouraged all of my literary pursuits. Susanna and her children gave me lessons in subjects like English and Greek, Latin, and even mythology. All these subjects were very uncommon for African women like me to learn. I was very fortunate.
No, that's just a very rough start to a very interesting way of life. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about your literary pursuits? Did you do anything with all the information you learned from the Wheatley family?
Why, of course I did. I wrote and published my first poem, Newport Mercury, when I was 13 years old. After that, I wrote and published quite a few more, but my most famous work was Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, which was published in 1773. I actually received patronage from the Countess of Huntingdon herself, Selina Hastings. But there had to be proof of my authorship, so there was a preface in my book of 17 men's signatures on proof that I had written those poems.
Wow, doesn't that make you the first African woman and U.S. slave to have a book of poems published?
Why, yes, it does.
Could you tell me a little more about your works and your place in
I was a
revolutionary
very strong
America?
supporter of America's fight for independence, so in quite a few of my poems I honored George Washington. One time I actually sent in one of my poems to George Washington himself, which prompted him to invite me to his headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts, which I of course accepted immediately. After visiting George, I traveled to London to promote a few of my poems, but while I was there I was battling some sickness and it was just plain awful. And when I returned to Boston, everything had changed. I was mourning the loss of my dear Susanna and John, and eventually, a few years later, in 1778, I married a man named John Peters. He was a free African man from Boston. We had 3 children together, and unfortunately, we lost all 3 during infancy. We struggled, and I eventually had to find work in a terrible, terrible boarding house. I did write some, but all the war and everything just weakened my energy for it. I sought out support for another volume of poetry, but I never got it.
Thank you so much for sharing your incredible story with us, Phyllis.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us, Margaret. Honestly, your story was one of my favorites.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be here, really.
Margaret, please tell us your story. You truly are amazing.
Oh, you're so kind. Well, I was born on November 12th in 1751 in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. I actually was orphaned at age 5 because my father was killed during an Indian raid and my mother was taken captive and she never returned. But my uncle adopted my brother and I, so life went on and I ended up marrying at age 21 in 1772 and I married John Corbin.
Wow. Now, you both were involved in the military, correct?
Yes, well, he joined the military, and I decided 3 years later that I wasn't going to sit around at home anymore. So I left with John for the military and took on the job of a camp follower, which was quite common for women during that time. I made money by cooking and doing laundry for the soldiers, and I took care of the sick and wounded.
Yes, and you fit into the Revolutionary America module that we discussed.
Yes, I do.
Now, didn't you actually fight in the war?
Yes, indeed I did, in November of 1776. I actually went out on the battlefield for the Battle of Fort Washington on Manhattan Island with my husband. I remember that the battle was raging and men were dropping everywhere and I could see the powerful British Army in their uniforms walking towards us. They just got closer and closer and finally I heard John call for me and I helped him load the cannon when his partner was killed and I eventually took over the cannon when John himself fell and died briefly after that.
Didn't that make you the first woman in combat during the battle for independence?
Oh, well, it's believed to be me.
And you were also the first woman who received a military pension, right?
Yes, I did receive that. I had actually been injured in the war when I was hit with enemy fire that nearly severed my left arm and brutally injured my jaw. But I did recover and I joined an invalid regiment in West Point and I helped wounded people until I was actually discharged in 1783.
You're quite extraordinary, Mrs. Corbin. Thank you so much for telling us your story.
Oh, well, you are quite welcome. I'm glad to be of service. And finally, we have Prudence Crandall joining us. Thank you so much for coming today, Prudence.
Certainly, I'm happy to be here.
Prudence, you challenged women's place in America and revolutionary America. Could you tell us a little bit about your life?
I'd be glad to. I was born in Hopkinton, Rhode Island on September 3rd. My parents, Pardon and Esther Carpenter Crandall, they moved us all to Canterbury when I was 10. I went to New England's Friends boarding school in Providence, and I studied arithmetic, Latin, and science. The subjects weren't really accepted for women, but since I was a Quaker, I got equal educational opportunities.
Oh, no, that's just fantastic. Now, what did you do with your educational opportunities?
Well, actually, in 1831, I opened a private girls' academy in Canterbury. It became one of the state's best schools because of my rigorous curriculum. In 1832, I admitted a young African American woman named Sarah Harries, whose dream was to become a teacher. But I had white parents who disagreed with my decision, and they withdrew all of their children from my school. I unfortunately had to shut down my school, but then I reopened it just for African American girls. But it was still ridiculed by the white community and was shut down by local white men who feared more African Americans would be drawn to the community and that would lead to interracial marriage.
That's just heartbreaking. Like, how did you handle these attacks and all this happening at your school?
There was not much that I could do. In 1833, Canterbury passed black law, making it illegal to run a school that taught African American students from a state other than Connecticut. After the editor of The Liberator, Garrison, helped me advertise my school, I had people pouring in from all over to bring their daughters to my school. But Canterbury protested, and I was arrested and sent to jail. First, it was a hung jury, and then a conviction, which overturned, but that is neither here nor there. On September 9th of 1834, a mob broke most of my school's windows and smashed all the furniture, and I truly felt it was unsafe for our students, so I finally closed the school.
Oh, no, that was a very brave thing you did, Prudence. I mean, fighting for the rights of all women's education like that. Now, what did you do after the school closed?
Well, in 1835, I married Calvin Filio. He was a Baptist minister and abolitionist like me. We left Connecticut and moved to LaSalle County in Illinois. I ran a school and was part of the women's suffrage movement. But after my husband died in 1874, I moved to Kansas and moved in with my brother. A couple years later, in 1886, I received a small pension from the Connecticut legislature. My school in Canterbury is now a museum in my honor, and I am a Connecticut state hero. And
Another extraordinary woman. You know, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Prudence.
well, thank you for having me.
Now, each one of these women has extraordinary stories.
They are each different with new things to learn from.
And as we said, there are so many extraordinary women that we've learned about and that we can learn from.
All lessons worth learning.
And stories worth telling.
These are just some of our favorites.
We hope you enjoyed.
Thanks for watching.
Dun, dun, dun. Dun, 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 ba-da!
Well, in 1831, I opened a private girls' academy in Canterbury. It became one of the state's best schools because of my rigorous curriculum. You are quite welcome.
Quick costume change.
She literally, the picture of her, she has a bonnet on her head, and then, like, working around.
Trying to get this out of my throat. Take 3. I'm sorry, everything's awful. We really are trying hard. I'm so sorry. No. No!